With the approach of the official kickstart of the ninth generation of gaming arriving just this fall, I feel it's time to reflect on exactly what got us here. Right now, I'm going to take this time to nickname each of the generations based on what came to establish that video game in the era, and especially the overall theme they all share in common. Tennis for Two is credited as the very first video game. However, it is also the first idea of manipulating what is on screen. The first official generation I refer to as the arcaded, because yes, gaming was now available to the masses in the forms of arcade and accessible with just pocket change. Video games would come to the home for the first time in the console known as the Magnavox Odyssey. It truly is a time for experimentation, but really I think the biggest challenge of this time is that game developers, as we now know them, and especially the console manufacturers, had no idea what all of this technology would mean for the future. To summarize, they are the pioneers of making gaming into what it has become now, even if they were just working with the most basic of dots and eventually sprites. Tuning the right amount of imagination and creativity along with the software and hardware available is something I can only imagine. Even now, we have various games created by one individual, such as Undertale or Dust and Elysian Tale. Both are challenged by high anticipation of those creators, but when I look back at all of these retro games, some that have been lost to time, we gotta think that these people had no one to learn from. They were the ones who had to pioneer this all on their own. Anything they invented that we know now within game development has become the basics of programming. With the rise of this incredible new medium, various companies jumped on to bring it into the home even further, such as with the Atari 2600, ColecoVision, and of course the Intellivision. Seemed that gaming from here was only going to rise, and that it truly wasn't a fad. I wonder what it would have been like to be alive at that time, in a whole new era of experimentation. Hey, what just happened? Oh, should have expected it, even though nobody could back then. Yet now it's time to reflect on a glorious time that people still remember today, what they call the 8-bit era. Yet like every generation, there's more than just bits involved here. Nintendo had revitalized the industry, brought it to a new medium and at a level never seen before, to the point where Sega even came up with the Master System. Yet gaming wasn't just reborn. Nintendo had brought it to a whole new level of quality. Even now, so many of these games we can play on the NES, and they work absolutely fine. Of course, Nintendo still has their seal of quality, but this was the first time gaming could be taken seriously. It was growing not only in hardware and technology, but in the mind and love of the people playing it, especially the children. So, for exceeding expectations and accelerating the gaming industry to a new level, I feel the 8-bit era, also the third generation of video games, should properly be titled the Revival Era. With the advent of the TurboGrafx 16 ushering in the next generation, the 16-bit era was officially coming full circle. Sega, of course, challenging both TurboGrafx 16 and Nintendo, came out with their Mega Drive, or as we got it, Genesis. Honestly guys, why Genesis? It's not even their first console. Mega Drive was just always a better title. And sadly, growing up, the only people I knew that had a Genesis are both of my cousins who lived 300 miles north of where I was. Even down here, everybody else had invested in another console, my first ever video game console, and still one of my all-time favorites. I mean, when it comes to the word nostalgia and definition, this is the number one thing that comes to my mind. There's just nothing else I can compare. And no matter which decade you yourself are born in, I'm positive you're totally familiar with this console. Of course, I'm referring to the mighty Super Nintendo, a console that is near perfection. Even amongst the aggressive Genesis ads attempting to put it down, it still flourished in a market and medium that was ever growing with more competition. Super Nintendo is an intensely powerful system, especially when comparing it to the same machines of the decade and specifically its own competitors. Yes, apparently it can't process near as fast as the Sega Mega Drive, but just with the Super FX chip, it pushed those graphics, demanding every bit of processing power just to render what we have here. I must say, Star Fox 2 specifically is the most intense Super Nintendo game there is. So with the emphasis of pushing hardware to the limit, going beyond the previous generations and beyond what gaming had been known for, I think it's appropriate to call the fourth generation of gaming the Empowered Era. Coming into the latter half of what many call the golden age of gaming, gaming was going through a bigger change than ever before. I'm not even sure with VR still in its infancy could ever compare to what gaming had gone through in this period. So obviously the N64 was well on its way, but this of course was really changing for gamers as much as it was for Nintendo. As Nintendo was partnering with Silicon Graphics for the Ultra 64, which of course will become the Nintendo 64, Sony of course was breaking away from Nintendo both with its own hardware and newfound knowledge of the gaming medium. However, Sony was approaching this in a whole new way. You see, with the PlayStation, many say this was the last classic console. And I totally get that, as after this, game consoles were more than just machines for playability. These consoles were an era of change, but not just for the industry going from 2D to 3D and cartridges into discs. The fifth era is an era of growth for the gamers as well as the medium itself. No longer was the scene as just a pastime for children. Video games were adapting with the growth of its players into adulthood and life ahead. For this era of maturity and growth from the medium for children to an all range of demographics from the youngest to the eldest, the proper title and moniker for this era we will refer to as the transitional era of gaming. In 1998, Sega debuted the Dreamcast, which of course kicked off the sixth generation of gaming. For a long time, I really had no clue what to nickname this, even though I lived through it and officially have owned every console, including the handhelds. This proved a challenge quite unlike the second level of Star Fox Assault. The goal is there and completely visible, but the right strategy and tactics of making it there requires the same amount of mental process as the physical process of learning your controls. This generation especially had three very different controller configurations, even compared to the fifth generation, which we discussed prior, knowing it as the transitional era. But what is the proper way to define the overall theme of the sixth generation? Well, it has taken a long time, but looking at what it achieved here with impressive graphics, refined controls, as well as online play, this gaming generation really proves to the satisfaction of developers that they no longer had the same limitations of the 90s and prior. These consoles were the most powerful yet, and anything that couldn't be achieved prior to this generation was finally there, right in front of our eyes and the tool set of the developers we know and love. To round off the first generation of this millennia, looking at how technology improved, how developers had everything at their disposal to make the games they'd wanted to for such a long time, I feel there's no better way to refer to this generation as the era of refinement. Long before I even knew of his existence, and long before I had proper internet access, walked past a kiosk in Meijer and saw the Xbox 360 for the first time. Honestly, its lack of color and even the shape of the console didn't strike me all that much, but man, did the visuals. This, of course, is the upcoming era of HD to a point where we have never known it before. To look at the PS1 graphics and the cinematics, they transition well to the gameplay graphics of PS2, and PS3 was no different, where the cinematics of Final Fantasy X looked incredible and especially comparable to that of the PlayStation 3's gameplay graphics. Can't really say this happened a generation later, but while we're on the subject and looking at the Wii, I do remember when this was first launched, and of course the first visual we saw back in 2005. This blew my mind. And of course I immediately assumed this is all gameplay of games, but now I know this is to inspire developers showing what the Wii is capable of. But when it came to the Wii being used to its full potential, Nintendo and first-party titles had that down, especially titles like Resident Evil 4 and Skyward Sword. Though I don't want to put one on a pedestal, Generation 7 of video games really has one triumph system, and that is none other than the DS. The console is also the first of the 7th generation, predating the Xbox 360 by 1 year entirely. When I first saw this thing, my immediate thought was Nintendo was making a console for the more mature, such as the adults and teenagers. I really am not even sure which game inspired me to buy the console, but I have to say this is the first time I bought a console just for the actual console with no game in mind. I played Game Boy Advance games on my DS original for a very long time, until about a year later when I finally got Animal Crossing Wild World, my very first DS game and still one of my all-time favorites. The DS brought touchscreen controls, the Wii brought motion controls, Sony was experimenting with 3D technology, and of course Microsoft had the Kinect, and that's really what it is. But the reason I give the Nintendo DS the #1 triumph of the 7th generation is not only because it was first, but it's the one that was used to its full potential and really is the definitive theme of the 7th generation. And for the amazing innovations of controls and going beyond just you and the screen, the proper way to name the 7th generation is the Transcendent Era. Now into our current generation, as we know as the 8th generation, started with the 3DS back in 2012, soon followed by, of course, the Wii U, the PlayStation Vita, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4. This current generation has fully embraced HD, as well as console upgrades. Hardware from the 3DS to the Xbox One X have both been a monumental difference over the previous iteration. For the first 2 years, I had no idea what to even refer to this generation was, or even its overall theme. But that all changed when Silent Hills, as we know as playable teaser, released on PS4. One overlooked thing of the Silent Hills demo that really adds the terror is how real it feels. It's comparable to taking a camcorder and just filming yourself walking down one singular hallway. The textures, the shadows, everything is convincing to a level I had not seen before that time. That alone helped inspire the perfect nickname for this current generation. Because we were associating and even confusing gameplay with real life for the first time ever, the proper name for the 8th generation of gaming is the Illusionary Era. And for a quick recap before the 9th generation: Gen 0, Conception. Gen 1, Arcaded. Gen 2, Receptive. Gen 3, Revival or Reset. Gen 4, Empowered. Gen 5, Transitional. Gen 6, Refinement. Gen 7, Transcendent. Gen 8, Illusionary. And now, as for Gen 9, the next gen that will start this fall, what will its theme be? Honestly, I have no idea. I could make some guesses, but even those would be vague. So at this point, all we can do is wait until both the Series X and the PlayStation 5 launch, and from there we can decide where the 9th gen will take us. The biggest surprise right now, at least for me, is how long the 7th generation lasted at a total of 14 years. And Gen 8 only came 6 years ago, less than half. Thankfully, we can trust both Sony and Microsoft to support the Xbox One and the PS4 for a few years ahead. But as for PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, I don't really care how long they last as long as they give us great and memorable games. I'm just really curious what I get to nickname this in a few years. It could even take till the end of the generation to figure out what it was all about. But if you ask me, I'm going to at least start out with a tuxedo. PlayStation 5 all the way.